Good morning, and thank you for coming out on this cold January day. This is the first in what I hope will be a series of talks in which we appreciate the natural beauty and uniqueness of Connemara. I want to express thanks to Tina Emin for encouraging me to put this together and working with me to prepare the presentation. We have structured this morning's talk into these parts. We'll start by taking a minute to appreciate the natural environment around us. Then we'll talk about what makes our region special. Next, we'll talk about threats to our ecosystem with an emphasis on invasive plants. We'll finish with a call to action and a discussion of what's next. We're very fortunate to live in a community surrounded by forests and lots of wildlife. Here are a few photographs I took in my backyard. A Gulf fritillary on blue mistflower, a red-shouldered hawk, a southeastern five-line skink. Wow, I can't believe that I can walk out my back door and see these creatures, and I don't have to go to a zoo to see them. Let's use this time this morning to be in awe of our surroundings. Let's highlight the uniqueness and beauty of Connemara. Let's appreciate the trees and the birds and the river and the animals and insects and the plants. Then I have a call to action to restore, preserve, and protect our natural surroundings with an emphasis on the threat of invasive plants. Let me start with a little bit about me. I have lived in Gwinnett since 1981, and I have lived in Connemara since 1991. I'm a retired software developer since 2020, and among my hobbies are nature and gardening. I'm a proud member of the Georgia Native Plant Society, Birds Georgia, and the Georgia Botanical Society. I studied the State Botanical Garden and earned a certificate in native plants, and recently earned a gold award from the Georgia Native Plant Society for my efforts to promote native plants and remove invasive species from my property. I'd like to start the discussion by showing you two maps, so bear with me a few minutes as this will provide the context for the rest of the presentation. We live in a temperate hardwood forest. I've lived in this region all of my life. If you're like me, you might take the forest for granted, but keep in mind that this important ecosystem covers only 7% of the world's landmass. This ecosystem exists in eastern US, most of Europe, northern China, Japan, Korea, a sliver of Australia, and a small part of South America. This is why we can import plants from other regions, and they often thrive here, sometimes too well, and we'll discuss that later in the presentation. European settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries brought plants with them from Europe, and most did well because the climate is similar. Then in the 19th century, gardeners in the US brought Asian plants due to fascination with Asian gardens. The reason for showing this will be clear when we discuss invasive plants. Now, within the temperate forests of the eastern United States, botanists delineate areas into ecoregions. Within each ecoregion, the geology, landforms, soils, vegetation, climate, land use, wildlife, and hydrology are similar. Our ecoregion is the Piedmont, which means foot of the mountain. This region stretches from north central Alabama to Virginia. The flora and fauna throughout the Piedmont is similar. Specifically, our region is more like the Piedmont in North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, than it is to South Georgia or to the mountains. In the notes, I provided a link to an online field guide to the southern Piedmont. This guide provides pictures and descriptions of over 700 organisms found in the southern Piedmont. The southeastern United States, particularly the southern Piedmont in North Alabama and Georgia, is one of the most biodiverse temperate regions in the world, and yet there are no national parks in the state of Georgia. In the notes, I provided a document talking about the biodiverse nature of our region. Let's take a minute to talk about birds. Do you have a bird feeder? Lots of people in the neighborhood do. But here's a fact. Your bird feeder does not sustain the birds. Your bird feeder attracts the birds to your yard so that you can get a good look at them. Birds need food, water, and habitat. Birds eat insects, seeds, and berries. Birds need caterpillars to feed their young. We need insects. Without the insects, there are no birds and other wildlife. Without the native plants, insects cannot propagate and the ecosystem fails. So birds are an indicator of a healthy ecosystem. So here's a fact about hummingbirds. Hummingbirds eat a wide range of invertebrates, such as tiny spiders, mosquitoes, aphids, flies, gnats, beetles, leafhoppers, and caterpillars. Hummingbirds like and need nectar, but 80% of their diet is insects and spiders. And this is according to an article from Doug Tallamy, which I will provide in the notes. If you have sunflower seeds in your bird feeders, you no doubt have seen this bird, the Carolina chickadee. To further illustrate my point about wild birds, here's a couple of facts about chickadees. Fact 1. One Wisconsin study showed that chickadees gathered only 21% of their food in winter from bird feeders, the rest from natural resources. Birds do not become addicted to bird feeders, and they always know how to fend for themselves in the wild. Fact 2. Chickadee parents deliver between 6,000 to 9,000 caterpillars to bring one nest of tiny birds to fledgling. What I want you to take away from this is that birds cannot survive and feed their young without the forest. They need the seeds and the berries provided by the plants. They need insects, which can only propagate on native plants. Do you want to talk more about birds? That would be great. I love that, and maybe that'll be a good topic for a future discussion. This is a great photo of a coyote. We have spotted them in the area. They are not a danger to people, but close contact should be avoided. If you're interested in coyotes, there's a website devoted to coyotes in Atlanta, atlantacoyoteproject.org. For part 2 of today's discussion, I'd like to focus on the threats to our local ecosystem. The best that I could discern, the 4 biggest threats are non-native invasive plants, which crowd out native species and provide little wildlife services. Deer overpopulation. In the absence of a major predator, there are too many deer and they are eating up everything they can reach. Domestic cats. What I like to say about this is keep your cats indoors. If they must be outdoors, put a bell on them. Cats kill 2.5 billion wild birds annually in the United States. They also kill small animals like chipmunks. I'll provide an article on this in the notes. Chemical sprays are another problem, particularly when we broadcast spray for mosquitoes or even to kill weeds in our yards. Many of these chemicals kill the insects that support the food web. For the remainder of this presentation, I will focus on the first of these threats, invasive plants. If we decide to continue the conversation beyond today, we can dive into these other topics further. A native plant is a plant that has been growing in a particular region or ecosystem for a long time, usually thousands of years. Native plants are well adapted to the physical conditions and coexisted with other species in their habitat. Native plants are an important part of the balance of nature and ecosystem services. A non-native plant, sometimes called exotic or alien, was introduced either purposefully or inadvertently outside its native range. Non-native plants may hinder or prevent survival of other species within the ecosystem. An invasive plant is any species that is not native to a given ecosystem and whose presence causes economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. Ornamental plants have value to humans. They may be native or non-native, are usually visually appealing to people. For example, we put them in the landscapes around our homes, or they provide cut flowers. So why are invasive plants so bad? Oftentimes, an invasive plant escapes our suburban landscape into the forest. Invasive plants damage the ecosystem by crowding out native species that provide ecosystem value. So if they're so bad, why do the nurseries still sell them? Profit motive mostly. Nursery growing invests a lot of money to produce these plants, and they can make money. But this is beginning to change. For example, the Bradford pear tree is now illegal to sell in 3 states. For more about the definition of invasive plants and information about common invasives in our area, I'm including an article in the notes from Trees Atlanta. So here is my top 10 list of invasives for Connemara. Let's look at these one at a time. Kudzu. Can't have a talk about invasive plants in the South without including kudzu. Fortunately, it is not yet a big problem in our neighborhood. It smothers trees and shrubs, but only grows in the sun, which is probably why I don't see it on my property. Japanese climbing fern. I'm seeing this more and more. Apparently, it is transported in the pine straw that we buy from South Georgia. Chinese holly, another landscape plant that is spreading into the woods. We have introduced this plant. Our builder used a cultivar named Nellie Stevens in our landscapes. It produces berries, and the birds are dropping them in the woods. Use American holly instead, which is a native to the Piedmont. Leatherleaf mahonia, another popular ornamental. It's evergreen and grows well in the sun or shade. Lots of nurseries sell this plant. But birds are spreading the berries everywhere, and it's popping up in the forest. It would be an okay plant if it would stay in our yards. Japanese honeysuckle. It's everywhere, and it strangles shrubs. I've spent hours unraveling it from azaleas and small trees. It's a menace. Bradford pear, originally planted as an ornamental, and it was supposed to be sterile. It was used as a landscape tree when Connemara was built, and some yards still have it. It is spreading wildly. I've pulled up at least a dozen saplings in my yard in the past year. It is now illegal to sell in 3 states, including South Carolina, Ohio, and Oregon. English ivy. It's okay if you don't let it climb trees. I see it popping up where it's not planted. Heavenly bamboo, or nandina, looks like a lovely Christmas decoration with evergreen foliage and red berries. However, the berries contain cyanide, which has been known to kill cedar waxwings, and the shrubs are spreading aggressively into the woods. Japanese stiltgrass, or microstegium. This has invaded Metro Atlanta in a big way over the last 5 to 10 years. It's an annual, so you only see it in the summer. It is now the dominant plant in the sewage right-of-ways in Connemara. Chinese privet, found primarily in low-lying areas near the river. Grows in shade or sun and spreads aggressively. Let me read a snippet from an article published in Southern Living in June of 2023. People like their privacy. That's why they put up fences. When they can't afford fences, they plant hedges. And that's how the South's worst weed now plagues millions of acres in southern states from Maryland to Florida to Texas. The villain is a large evergreen shrub or small tree called Chinese privet. It's worse than kudzu. according to the science tracking its spread. Worse than kudzu. That's because kudzu needs sun to grow. Chinese privet, on the other hand, grows just about anywhere. In sun, in shade, in wet soil, in dry soil, in the city, in the country, all over more than 3 million acres of southern forests. Here's another 5 that I'm keeping my eye on. Chinese wisteria, which I see a lot in the parks in the city, but I haven't seen it here yet. Autumn fern, which is a popular fern that's sold in all the big box stores, and I'm afraid that the spores are going to get loose into the woods and spread. Elaeagnus, or autumn olive, is a big problem in the city parks. It creates big thickets. Liriope, the variety we have in Connemara, is mostly the variegated variety that hasn't been a problem, but it's something to watch for. And mondo grass, which I've actually had spread into my yard, and it was a real problem to get rid of it. Here are some articles about these plants, and I'll provide all these links in the notes. Here are some of the impacted areas in Connemara. Along the river, I'm seeing privet and stiltgrass. In landscapes, I'm seeing English ivy, Bradford pear, mahonia, and nandina. In the woods, I'm seeing plants pop up, most commonly holly, mahonia, nandina, and honeysuckle. And in the unintended areas, I'm seeing kudzu and climbing fern. So how do you know if you have these plants? Well, it turns out there's an app for that. Okay, here's some that I have on my phone that have worked pretty well. They're accurate probably 80 to 90% of the time. Very helpful. Now, I'm not going to spend time in this presentation showing you how to use these apps, but you can download them, and if you want to contact me later, I'll help you use them. So let's talk about removing invasives. So the first method of removing invasives is basically to just pull them up, particularly like with honeysuckle and privet. This time of year when the soil is moist, you can just hand pull them. For the bigger plants, use a shovel. I've got this shovel here has been very handy. And then for the larger ones, they make this device called a weed wrench, or mine's branded uprooter, where it can grab the plant and just pull it out by the roots. Now, the advantage of this is that you don't have to use any chemicals, but sometimes when you pull up the plants, you don't get all the root system, and then the plant just grows back. One of the other disadvantages is that when you start pulling plants up by the roots, you disturb the soil. And when you disturb the soil, you bring more seeds to the surface, and oftentimes you'll see more weeds grow. Now, another way to suppress these invasive plants is mulching. So we do this a lot around our house. This is a scene down by the tennis courts. It's a very effective way of doing that. It basically smothers the plants so they don't get any sunlight, so they can't germinate and they can't grow. Now, of course, the problem with this is you have to keep reapplying it. And as I mentioned before, sometimes mulches like pine straw, when it's transported to our area, will sometimes bring seeds and spores with it. So you have to be watchful for that. Another thing you could do to limit the plants is just cutting them. We're actually doing this all the time when we cut our lawns, right? Or the big field down by the tennis courts, because as these these woody and herbaceous plants and small trees, and as they sprout, we're just cutting them down all the time, and then most of them just die off. Now, for the larger ones, like pictured here, what I typically do is you can cut the tree off low to the ground, and then immediately put concentrated chemical on there, like Roundup concentrate, and just dab it or paint it onto that surface, and that will systemically go down in the roots and kill the plant. So that's an effective way to get rid of the larger shrubs and the small trees. Another effective way of removing invasive plants is using chemicals. Here are 4 possible choices. Glyphosate, which is the primary ingredient in Roundup. In its concentrated form, you can paint it on the freshly cut stumps, as mentioned in the previous slide. When diluted, you can spray it on the foliage of plants, and it'll seep down into the stem and roots of the plant and kill the whole plant. One problem with foliar spraying is that if you overspray onto other plants that you don't want to kill. So one strategy is to spray at a time of the year when the plants that are native to the area are dormant and don't have any leaves. So the only thing you're spraying is the plant that you want to kill. Triclopyr is sometimes called brush killer, is another popular chemical, very similar to use as the glyphosate. Cethoxtin is primarily for grasses, and in the right dilution, you can actually spray it on stilt grass and kill the stilt grass without killing the other plants around it. Another popular chemical is to use a high concentration of vinegar. I don't particularly like this option because for 2 reasons. One is that the vinegar tends to kill the foliage of the plant, but doesn't kill the roots, and so the plant will come back. So I'd rather use glyphosate, which is a systemic herbicide. The other thing about vinegar is when it gets down into the soil, it can kill the microbes and earthworms and the other beneficial organisms that are in the soil. So for those reasons, I tend to stay away from the use of vinegar. So what now? We need to develop a neighborhood strategy to protect our natural areas. Maybe we form an environmental committee to put together plans and present them to the homeowners board. We can organize work days to clean up those areas and to remove invasive plants. But that covers the common areas. On private lands, we need to educate homeowners on invasive plants and how to remove them and how to keep their non-native plants from spreading into the wild areas. So that's all I have for today. So what's next? Well, when we first talked about having these discussions, there were lots of things that we thought that we might talk about, and it was too much information for just one talk. So maybe we want to talk about trees or landscaping or native plants. Maybe we want to talk about deer and how to keep deer out of our gardens. Talk about lawns or birds. I love to talk about birds. We could talk about insects, mosquito control and safe ways to control mosquitoes. We could talk about the Yellow River and gardening, particularly gardening with native plants. I like that topic. So let me know what you think and what you might want to talk about, and maybe we can schedule some future talks. And I thank you for your time today.